And for those of you out there listening to this, and you're like, man, I feel like I'm in a season where God has forsaken me. But I've been scared to articulate that. I've been scared to express my doubts. I've been scared to complain because I've heard complaining is bad. Well, first of all, I want to tell you, it's bad to complain about God. It's not bad to complain to God. The Psalms give us plenty of permission and precedent for complaining to God. God can handle your complaints. He's big enough for them. And he has a way of reframing them and revealing so much about who we are and our struggle, what we don't know. But God's not afraid of your doubts. He's not afraid of that cry. And I have found, like, when we get to that point where we cry that out, like, that's where we really start exchanging empty words and routine and religion for a relationship that is robust enough, that is meaningful enough for the life that we're called to live in this crazy, distracting world.
Hey man, you want to talk about God? Man, Addison Bevere, welcome, man.
What's up, man?
I'm so pumped.
Thank you. It's good to be on.
I'm so pumped that you're here. And I'm even more pumped because your book, Words with God, it's coming out. Actually, when we release this, it will be out, right? Okay. And so we're going to release this on the 18th. So if you're listening to this on the 18th, the book is out. It's here April 18th. But Addison, honestly, man, just thank you so much for taking your time out to be here with me and Matt tonight as we go through this book that you wrote, man.
Thanks, man. It's an honor to be here with you, Taylor. We love you and Brooke and Matt. I just met you tonight, but it's good to meet you. And I'm excited for the fact checking and the producing and everything you're going to bring in this. I'm a little nervous too, but no, it's going to be great. Looking forward to the conversation, gents. And Taylor, thank you for all the encouragement. I know you've sent me some texts about the book, and it means a ton, man.
Well, thank you for sending us an early copy of it. We got to read it a little bit, and it's actually kind of crazy because me, Corey, who is normally our host, and Matt, our producer, we have all read the pre-copy, right? And it's kind of crazy because I don't know if this happens very much, but we're over here, man, and we have literally 10 pages worth of notes, all from this book. Wow. That we wrote down. We're ready to go. We have all of the questions ready for you, and Matt's ready to fact check every single one of them, dude.
That's right.
Come on.
So you came out with Saints a couple of years ago, which was your first book. I know you helped to write or co-authored Holy Spirit, right? And now Words with God is here. And one of the things that I loved about Words with God in particular was I felt like you you talked a lot about kind of not necessarily in order, but your life and different things that have happened. And a lot of those were shared in like different kind of vulnerabilities that you have had, or maybe even doubts and things that you've had throughout your life. And honestly, what I'd love to do before we really dive hard into the book is, could you give us, for anybody who doesn't know you, what I really want to do is, I want to go over Words with God. I want to go over this book, but I also want to go over Addison Bevere, right? And the man behind this book that's going to come out and honestly, in my opinion, change some lives. It's going to break some chains. It's going to set some people free. And I really, really do believe that. But could you give us, your story? Where do you come from? Who are you? What's your goal in life? Coming up to Words with God coming out and being out there for the people.
Yeah. So Matt alluded to this. So grew up in a great home, two phenomenal parents, love God, love each other. They've been married for over 40 years, been in ministry for 40 years this year. So they really embody the idea of faithfulness, and have the utmost respect for them. And grew up in that shadow in a lot of senses. And moving into primarily my teenage years, it's not that I rejected God, but I definitely rejected the idea, the construct that a lot of people put me in just because of who my parents were, and just presuming to know me because of who my parents were and label me and tell me what I'm supposed to do and what it's supposed to look like. And it, I was terrified of that. I was like, I can't do this stuff. And I was just intimidated by the idea of following in their footsteps. So I I didn't run from God, but I definitely ran from Christianity, and it led me down a path of philosophy and studying different worldviews and different religions and different practices and stuff like that. And so that carried me into my senior year, and then my senior year I had a radical encounter with God, and it all kind of came together, and I was planning to go to law school, and God told me to actually go serve at a Messenger, which is the organization that my parents have found. I'm like, that's the last thing I want to do is go serve at, like, I'm trying to get as far away from this as possible. But man, I couldn't shake it, Taylor. Like I couldn't let it go. And I prayed about it. I wanted to be something different. So instead of going to law school, I ended up going to this Bible school that had a prayer internship, and I did a year-long prayer intensive. And it marked my life. It drove me into Scripture. I've always been someone who's very curious about the truth of things, someone who likes to search subjects out to really understand what's going on.
What year was that in?
And
that prayer intensive. What year was that in?
What year was that? Let's see here. That would have been what, late 2000s. So what would that have been? Yeah, like 15 years ago. I think that's maybe not quite that long ago. Yeah, somewhere around there. But then I started serving at Messenger, and it just had a lot of favor, and I grew within the organization, and was very content to do that. And I was great with being behind the scenes and serving in that capacity. And through a few different people and a few different messages, it just became very clear, like God was saying, hey, there's some other things I need you and I want you to pursue, and you've been running from them. These words have been spoken over you, these promises that have been given to you that you've wanted to let go of. Like, you need to pursue those. That there's something on your life. It's legacy oriented. It's building on what your parents have forged, what they've given to you, but even beyond that, what God has given to you. And so I really started praying into that, seeking to understand what that looks like, what that means. And this whole time I was serving in different capacities. I have a background in writing, and so I was helping with different projects and stuff like that, and doing whatever I could. But it became clear, hey, you need to go deeper into this. And so that's a part of the journey. But about 10 years ago, I share this in chapter 2 of the book, but I began a season, and it was a series of things that happened in my life. I had a lot of intense things happen in a short period of time. Some traumatic stuff happened to me, and things that just kind of rocked my world. And I had never struggled with sleep before, but all of a sudden insomnia became a regular companion of mine. For almost 5 years, I dealt with insomnia. I mean, a good night of sleep for me was like 4 or 5 hours of sleep. That was good. I would have a hard time falling asleep. When I would fall asleep, I would get up at 2:30 every single morning and would not be able to get back to sleep. Sometimes I would just head into my office at 3 a.m. because I was like, what's the point? And so that developed some really unhealthy habits and behaviors and tendencies and stuff like that. And in this season, I felt so abandoned by God, and had really given myself over to this idol of who I was supposed to be and what I could be and what I could do and how much people depended on me and how important I was. And it got to the point where I started believing, I would never have articulated this, but based on my actions, started believing that the world doesn't spin without my contribution, which is a very dangerous place 100%. To be. And I share this in Words with God, and this became real to me in this season, but that God doesn't deliver us from a thing if he knows that thing is going to deliver us to him. And in this season, like I wanted a form of deliverance from the insomnia. But the reality is, and the anxiety that went with that, and the health complications that went with that, and the perpetual fog that went with that, all of that. Um, but it became so clear to me at the end of that season that God was doing this incredible work, even in the perceived separation in me, where I was journeying to a part of myself that I didn't even know existed, so that I could surrender and give it to Him and release that space to Him, for Him to do whatever work He wants to do in and through that place of brokenness and fear and shame. And and that was catalytic for my journey into prayer, because I didn't stop pursuing God during these 5 years. Y'all, I chased Him. Like I legit, like I was in Scripture every day. I was praying. Like I was worshiping when I didn't feel. I mean, I was going out, and I share this in the book, but I was sitting around with a group of friends one night, and this was like probably 3 to 6 months. I think I said in the book, I think I said 6 months. It was like 3 to 6 months. Maybe it might have been 4 months before. Like I had my moment that I share about in the book. And I was in this group, friends, they're all talking about how wonderful God is and God's presence and His goodness and all the warm fuzzies. And they were crying and stuff. And I'm just sitting there in this group, just real into a group. And I'm like, y'all are crazy. Like, I ain't heard anything from God. Like, I haven't felt anything. And I didn't want to share that. But my wife, she's one of those people who doesn't let you get away with not sharing. And she's like, hey, you need to share. And so that was me, man. And God, like
it's
yeah.
crazy because I don't, we've talked several, quite a bit over the past couple of months, and I think that one of the reasons, why I dove into this book and why I loved it so much is because the past year and a half of my life, I have been struggling a lot personally with anxiety, with problem sleeping, with all of these different things. And what's kind of crazy is the turnaround moment happened for me in August when I met you, right?
Really?
At Messenger. I mean, I'm not going to say it was you, but it was Messenger Cup as a whole. But you had a part to do with it. But there was this piece of me, of that story that you told of, and that moment that you just kind of related, of like being in this circle and everybody's happy and fuzzy and God, yeah, let's go. And you're just kind of sitting there. Like, that is honestly how I showed up to Messenger Cup. And I was expectant, but I was hurting a lot. And coming out of that, a lot of things changed for me, and Kingdom Empowered as a whole was born coming out of that week. And one of the things you talk about a lot in the book is all these distinctions that we as people make, right? Of this like sacred versus secular kind of thing. And all these, I think you give like 6 different versions of that same thing, of how we compartmentalize these different things in our life, right? And Kingdom Empowered really came out of, I've been building businesses, I've been doing these things, and I've been following God over here, and I've been doing this over here and doing this over here. Why can't my ministry and what I do for a living and God be everything, be what I want it to be, all in the middle? And so I just took so much out of this book, because the past year or so had, like, a lot of these things, these vulnerabilities, these things, experiences that you went through, I've been going through recently and have been coming out of, over the past couple of months. So to have this and then put this book on top of it and be able to take things out of it, and we're going to get into some of these things in just a minute, have been really, really, really powerful. And so, one of the things that I wanted to really ask you is, one of the things I love asking about or thinking about is just the title, right? And so the book is about prayer, but words with God. Where did that come from? What's the significance of that? What's the background of that? Where does it come from?
Yeah, I mean, it has. First of all, I just want to say, Taylor, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. I had no idea. And so I'm trying to take inventory of my interactions with you at the beginning of the event versus toward the end of the event, because I know we met anyway. So
Yeah.
I was going, as you were sharing that, I'm going through this. Is like, because I know we talked for a while during the award ceremony, and you got to share with me, and that was really special, hearing what God had done, and shared a bit about even your connection with Danny and different things like that, which is just incredible. So thank you for sharing that. But words with God. So dual meaning, and prayer. And I mean, y'all have read the book, so this is actually fun, because I think I've done 1 or 2 interviews with people so far who have read the entire book. So this is different. Normally it's like they've read a chapter or 2 and they like it, but it's fun getting to talk to people who actually read the whole thing, because I feel like I don't have to explain it all. But the dual meaning, how do we have words with God? How do we pray? Is there a right way to pray? And if so, what does that look like? Right. So that's a part of this book. But then I would say the more significant part of this book is, how do we open up the conversation? How do we open the conversation and have words with God? How do we bring conversation into places that we maybe didn't have words with God before, because of pain or disappointment, or because we didn't view it as a space, a conversation that God would move into, that God would occupy, that wasn't off limits. And so that was the idea for Words with God, is going after both of those. And there's the game Words with Friends. And so we have Words with God. And then the subtitle is really important, but trading boring, empty prayer for real connection. And just fun fact, it was originally trading boring, transactional prayer for real connection. We changed it to empty because we felt like transactional might be a bit, for people who get it, they get it. Like, they get transactional. It's like, totally, religion is very transactional. I've been brought up in that. That's been my paradigm for prayer and engaging with God. But we felt like empty would reach a bit further, and so we ended up going with that one.
I wanted to ask you, so you talk about praying and having a structure, and as a kid, I can remember growing up and kind of being taught how to pray, and it was that, Dear Jesus, as if you're writing a letter. Thank you for today.
Yep.
Express your gratitude. Go into your requests, and always end with, in Jesus' name I pray, amen. And as a kid, I remember that structure and feeling like it had to be perfect, and practicing it before I would go to bed. And it felt like as soon as my eyes closed, that's when the prayer started, and it would almost become like this ritual. And if I messed up or stuttered at any point, then I had to reopen my eyes again, and then start over, close my eyes, do the prayer.
Wow.
And not really until maybe about a year ago did I even understand like the gravity behind even just thank you for today, like just being grateful to even have today. And I'm 26, so I mean that's 25 years of prayer that's kind of been in that same structured format. And that's really changed the way that I've prayed. And going through your book really challenged me in a lot of ways. And I want to know, for you, if you could talk a little bit about, what did prayer look like for you growing up? How has it changed over the years? And then how do you, as a father of 4, how do you now pass on how to pray to your kids?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say my prayer life early on was primarily me speaking to God. So I was the one having the words, if you will. So it was prayers at night, prayers before meals, prayers when I'm in a setting that requires prayers. But then outside of that, maybe there was an occasional thought where I would articulate a prayer, and I very much like wanted to hear the voice of God. And I talk about in chapter 1, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book, just if you're asking like author, chapter 1, even though it's a shorter chapter, because I believe that all of us have this desire to hear the voice. And that's a theme that I bring into the rest of the book. Like, why do we struggle to hear the voice? What is it about the voice that is so elusive to us? And so if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're like, man, I just want to hear God's voice. Like, what in the world? Like, am I having words with God or just words with myself? I want someone to talk back. I wanted to go into that pain, and I wanted to put some words in the silence. But I would say, Matt, the older that I've gotten and the more that I've learned to live in union with God and awareness of God and how God works, and a concept in the book that I unpack a lot is this idea of an integrated life. I have defaulted to more listening than I do speaking. I'm more comfortable with silence. I'm more comfortable just sitting there. I actually have a closet right here, which is just a little dark closet, man. It's not that big, but I can get in there. And that's not where I always go. But when I go into that room specifically, my posture is I'm listening. Like all I'm doing is I'm sitting in darkness and I'm listening. And I've had some profound encounters with God in that space. But to be honest with you, as I've learned to open the conversation and as I faced off with silence, because I think we're all terrified of silence to some degree. There's a quote in the book from Maeterlinck, and I think I put it in chapter 2 as an epigram in chapter 2, but it says, we don't know each other yet, for we have yet to be silent together. And this idea that there's a language of God that is only experienced in what we think is silence. It's a thin silence. It's not really silence. It's a thin silence. And I love, even if you look at 1 Kings 19, here you go, fact check. 1 Kings 19, Elijah, when the voice comes to Elijah, we translate it into English as still small voice, but the voice wasn't in the earthquake or the wind or the fire. And we look for the voice of God in the spectacle, right? Like I always wanted the heavens to open and a light to come down and a big booming voice. But the reality is God most often comes in what reads in Hebrew as a thin silence. Even if you look at Jesus's life, there's 3 moments when the Father speaks affirmation over the Son that we see. But so much of what Jesus grew into, and the writer of Hebrews describes this process beautifully, but so much of what he grew into was actually as he moved into the everyday environment. And John's gospel captures this so well with him making statements like, I only do what I see the Father doing. Like he lived in union. He had this awareness, this communication, ongoing communication. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians 13 as a final benediction, he says, may the communion of the Spirit be with you always. Jesus says in John 16, it's better for you that I go away. Why? Because there were limitations to Jesus' bodily presence when he was in that form. There were limitations, but he said, my Spirit's going to come. And the things that seem external or things that seem at arm's length right now, my Spirit's going to come and make those an intimate part of who you are. But for us, because we don't get that, because we think prayer is, we check a few boxes, we say the right words, blah, 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 and that's prayer. Like we are missing out on what Paul describes as praying without ceasing, praying constantly, praying always. Like that, it's not you moving your mouth, talking all the time to God. It's about you living with this awareness that God wants to have words with you in silence and in sound. There will be moments where it will catch you so off guard, where you will speak something so clear, prophetic, profound to people. And I'm not just talking about that particular service, but that's a part of it. I mean, I had a moment, this is wild. I had a moment a couple weeks ago with a buddy of mine, and I actually didn't know this guy very, very well at the time. We've become close since this moment because of what happened. But I was praying, it was at night, and I was going through my routine. Julie was already in bed, and I was praying, and God put this person on my heart. So it was so clear. And I just felt I was to intercede. So I started interceding for this person. And what I mean by interceding was just being sensitive to what the Spirit was speaking to me about this person. And I opened up my Bible. And I actually I remember I was in Hebrews chapter 10. This is where I was in Hebrews chapter 10. And I started praying into that specifically, what I was reading there. And anyway, I was like, okay, I'm done. But the Spirit was like, you need to text him. I'm like, I'm not texting him. I barely know this guy. Like, I'm not texting him. This is really specific, really intimate. No way I'm texting him. Next morning, same thing happens. So I finally sent him a text, and I'm like, man, I do not want to do this. Anyway, he sends me a voice memo back, and basically he's like, you read my mail, all these things, so specific. He was like, I was crying out, and like I needed to hear this today. Like I was asking for this. I would never have expected this from you. You're not someone who's in my world. We haven't even really talked in 2 years. He's like, this is crazy. Well, that's the kind of conversation that God wants to let us in. Just a couple weeks ago, actually, it was just a couple days after this, I was going to speak to a group of 30 worship leaders. And hey, if any of y'all, listen, I'm not talking about any worship leaders out there, okay? I love my worship leaders. I do. I've actually had the honor of writing a few worship songs. And so I'm with this group of worship leaders, and I'm sharing with them. And the night before I was praying, and I was sitting in the kitchen, and again, everyone was in bed. And I was just sitting there. It was silent. And I was just sensitive to the Spirit. I'm like, Spirit, what's going on? Like, where are we at? Like, what? We're just taking inventory of the day. We're just having a moment in the silence. And y'all, our world is terrified of silence.
It is.
There's so much noise in our world. You know how countercultural it is to embrace silence? You know how countercultural it is to search for the language of God that is in silence? Like, if y'all are like, I don't hear God's voice. Well, if you're looking for God's voice in the noise of this world, you're probably not going to hear it. Not saying that God can't speak through anything, but you're probably not going to hear it.
You said this in chapter 10, Addison. You said, this is a literal quote from the book. Our conscious is a way the voice speaks to us and directs our lives. It's an inner witness or God awareness that leads us forward. But based on what we find in Scripture, the conscious is like a communication line that can be hijacked and repurposed by the accuser. A conscious is trustworthy when it is God conscious. And I tell you what, man, what you're talking about right now, and when I read this, there's this thing of like always having the question of like, oh, is that like I praying or even just in my day, and I got to do this, right? And then it's like, is that me? Is that God? Is that the accuser? Where is it coming from? And just the one line of a conscious is trustworthy when it's God conscious, along with the rest of the book to provide context to that.
Sure.
Kind of, it hit me, man.
Well, bro, we live in a world that weaponizes conscience. I mean, we live in a world that weaponizes morality, and so the conscience itself can be hijacked, and that's and the idea here, especially with the writer of Hebrews, the way the word conscious is used, it's used to describe a God consciousness, this God awareness. Like when you live God aware, then the accuser and the voice of the accuser, which is loud and persistent, does not get to dictate the way you engage in the difficult matters of our world. Y'all, the reason why our world is so messed up and the rhetoric of our world is messed up is because everyone is listening, not everyone, but you know what I'm saying, speaking generally, listening to the voice of the accuser. And so what's being communicated is communicated through a spirit of accusation. And if we want to be people who have a word for our world, like a word that heals, a word that is true, a word that is reflective of God and the things of God, the way of God, like we have to receive that from God first. Like so much of the I told you so, you're wrong, whatever, that happens in our world is a reflection, is an extension of what the accuser is doing to us, that is actually keeping us from hearing the voice of God and understanding what world we're called to be a part of and what it means for us to engage in that world and the complexities and the difficulties and the craziness of our world. Engage with that world with clarity, with sensitivity, and with boldness. Like there's a gentleness, and these qualities that seem like they're contradictory, they come together and in the work of the Spirit and the truth of how God speaks to us.
Listen, bro. Okay, okay. By the way, he talks about all this in the book. Okay, so if you want to know more about what he's talking about, go get the book. Okay, there will be a link everywhere. Go to our Instagram. Go down to the bottom of the podcast. There's a link to go get it everywhere. But I want to talk to you about something very specifically that you wrote, Addison. It was my second favorite passage in the book. Okay. It was
what your first is. I want to know what your first is after this.
Oh, we're gonna get to that one.
Okay.
We're gonna get to that one. But I'm gonna read it to you. I'm gonna read some quotes again. But I have a story about this quote, and it's exactly what you were just talking about. It's on page 76. I don't remember what chapter it's in, but the accuser's greatest fear is that prayer would become an intimate part of us and reshape our world. He's terrified of us having words with the Father and wants to remove us from the conversation. He'd prefer the conversation be short, impersonal, and stick to religious matters. He prefers prayer to maintain a slave to the split, those past divisions of sacred and secular, a practice that is done at only the right time and in the right way. So you're talking about how the accuser wants to see prayer and how his greatest fear is that it would become an intimate part of our lives. And, you were just speaking about praying bold prayers, right? And here's something crazy is I went back and I found notes, okay, from a conference that I was at on February 4th, 2013. And your mom was preaching.
Wow.
And I 2013.
2013. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I have notes. It was at a business conference, and I highlighted these notes, but it's kind of crazy because what was so cool about it is I can share these, but these were all the notes from your mom preaching that morning. But down here at the bottom, these 3 lines have stuck with me for years and years and years and years. And it's, we do not pray safe prayers. We pray scary prayers, and we ask boldly. We don't beg or be pitiful. If you're not praying prayers that scare you, then you're not scaring the enemy. And you're not called to live safe or small. You're called to rise up and be a person of faith. Our God works in the realm of impossible. What are you giving him to work with? So I went and
that sounds like my mom.
Yep. I went and found these notes. But what's crazy is I heard that, like I said, 10 years ago that your mom was speaking. But now I'm reading this book that you wrote, that Holy Spirit worked in you, and you dove into these things, and you went deep, and you went, it was so good. Like, I don't know how else to say this. I was talking to Matt actually earlier and I mean this in the opposite of disrespectful, but I read Saints, and Saints is a great book. You should go check out Saints as well. Okay. But you don't go, like, Saints is an amazing book that I feel like is written for everybody. And Saints is this amazing book that I feel like everyone will get something out of. Not that everyone won't get something out of Words with God, but Words with God has some things that are going to challenge you in it. And Words with God, you wrote this in such a way that it has some things that will push some people and challenge some people. And I just love this of, his greatest fear is that prayer would become an intimate part of us and reshape our world. Can you just delve into that, like go on that, and what exactly you're talking about when you write that?
Well, I mean, I share in the first chapter that one of the main reason I believe we struggle to hear the voice of God is because we look for God's voice in the voice and the tenor of the accuser. We expect God to sound like the accuser, and that's a big reason why we're led into the canyon. And it's in the canyon where our constructs of God and of life and purpose and all of that are challenged, and we get to exchange empty words and sentiments for a real connection, for a real knowledge of God and how God works. And when you look at the enemy thrives in and through disintegration. So that's sin. Sin disintegrates, it separates it. Literally, you trace it back, you look at the etymology of our English word sin, it means to sunder, it's like to break apart. And so the enemy of our soul, he wants to fracture our lives by breaking it into these different pieces, compartmentalizing our lives, our sense of self. And by doing that, he convinces us to not allow God into certain parts of who we are, to not surrender certain parts of us to God's holiness and his goodness and his faithfulness and his work that he wants to do in and through us. And so many people have forfeited meaning and purpose and connection with God because they view a big part of their life as sacred or as secular. And God's like, I want in that. Literally the word profane, and I write this in the book, but it comes from the Latin profanum, which means outside the temple or before the temple. And when Jesus says things like, tear down this temple in 3 days, I rebuild it. Or when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3 or 2 Corinthians 6 or 1 Corinthians 6, like, you are God's temple. What he's saying like, hey, the holy has been relocated to where you go and what you do. And that doesn't mean by holy, doesn't mean you slap a fish sticker on it or you make it about church or you find a way to weave a cliche Christian lyric into it. That's not what that is. He's saying, no, you realize that where human flourishing happens, like God designed, God honoring human flourishing, that's holy. That is sacred. That is beautiful. And when we see these prophetic visions all throughout the prophets of where this is going, the promise of the earth and the heavens to come, like where that's going, it involves so much of what we would now cast aside as just everyday, mundane, ordinary, unholy, secular life. And we as temple people, we as people of the Spirit, we get to go in and reclaim those spaces, and the enemy doesn't want us to do that. And so he'll accuse us. See, I didn't write this in the book, Taylor, directly, but I'm gonna share something with y'all that's not in the book. This is a little controversial what I'm about to share with you. Okay,
I'm all for it.
So I've spent a lot of time studying the book of Hebrews. Okay, and there are some statements in the book of Hebrews that make me scratch my head. Like, what? Like, did he really, or she maybe, write that? Like, that's radical. One of the statements that has always got me is in chapter 2 and chapter 4, where the writer of Hebrews makes the comment that Jesus has been tempted the way we've been tempted. Like, there's no. I'll actually, you know what? I'll read it directly to you, just because it's so radical. But it says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." I'm like, man, this is some stuff. All right. So, and I get into this a bit in chapter 10, but not to this degree. Well, I started thinking, what is the great temptation? Like, if Jesus had to experience the whole human experience, and we're recording this during Holy Week, so this feels significant to me right now. Like, what is the greatest temptation? What is our greatest temptation as humans? What is the biggest obstacle, the greatest obstacle that we have to hurdle in this journey of life, in our journey of connecting with God, having words with God? What do you think it is? I'm going to ask you, what do you think it is? I'm not trying to set you up, but what do you like? Really think about that. Like, what experience is ubiquitous, is available to all of us? We all navigate this.
Yeah, so I'm gonna cheat and use your book a little bit. I don't know if it's in there or not, but I would say the tempt to worship yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Matt, do you have any thoughts?
It's tough. The first thing that kind of came to my head was kind of the search for status, which is that same idea of self glorification.
Yeah. The pride. Yeah. Pride of life, lust of the flesh, right?
Yeah,
Lust
but I
of the
feel like
eyes.
we've been set up.
I think so
Matt.
too.
I feel like we've just been.
Bro, I'm not trying to set y'all up, but I think it's even more intimate than that. I think that's something that we default to when we don't feel known, we don't feel seen. I mean, just think about the way the accuser was able to get Adam and Eve to turn on God. It was, man, like, he's holding out on you. Like, there's a form of separation. There's something that you don't know. There's something you haven't experienced. But I think we see it on the cross, man. I think that's where we see it, with Jesus quoting Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, Psalm 22 is a fascinating psalm. It's a messianic psalm. And it's a psalm that points to where God is ultimately taking the world and taking his people. Now, when Jesus would have quoted Psalm 22, you got to remember, they would actually sing the Psalms, right? So this was like a song that they would sing. So it wasn't as much like chapter or verse as it is for us now. It was more like, I'm referencing this song that means something in its entirety, because they would learn these songs that mean something to the people who are hearing this, or the people who are going to engage with it. It's different than how we engage with it. Well, Later in Psalm 22, the psalmist David writes, "You do not abandon the afflicted in their affliction. You do not turn your back, hide your face on them." This is the same psalm that describes the moment of the cross where they're casting lots, and they're devouring him. Like that's the same psalm. This is all Psalm 22.
Mhm.
And then it hit me, guys, it hit me. I fully believe that the greatest temptation that we navigate is this idea, this belief that God has abandoned us, that God will not reach out to us when we reach out to him, that God is not there, that we're speaking into the void, that there's nothing but silence on the other side, that there is going to be something that trumps or contradicts what Paul writes in Romans 8 about the extent and the depth and the breadth of God's love, like something. And I think that Jesus, in that moment, I think he had to navigate the human experience of believing that we are separated from God. Now, he moved through that moment, as we must move through that moment, because there's something on the other side. But Jesus dignified in that moment. He dignified the cry of, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And for those of you out there listening to this and you're like, man, I feel like I'm in a season where God has forsaken me, but I've been scared to articulate that. I've been scared to express my doubts. I've been scared to complain because I've heard complaining is bad. Well, first of all, I want to tell you, it's bad to complain about God. It's not bad to complain to God. The Psalms give us plenty of permission and precedent for complaining to God. God can handle your complaints. He's big enough for them. And he has a way of reframing them, and revealing so much about who we are and our struggle and what we don't know. But God's not afraid of your doubts. He's not afraid of that cry. And I have found, like, when we get to that point where we cry that out, like, that's when we really start exchanging empty words and routine and religion for a relationship that is robust enough, that is meaningful enough for the life that we're called to live in this crazy, distracting world that is so confused and so disoriented. And we're called to be people who embody peace and joy and gentleness and courage and boldness and all of these qualities that come with being the people of God. And I believe that can only happen as we first have words with God. Going back to what I shared earlier, if we want to have the right words for our world, we have to first have words with God. Okay, there's this moment. I got to share this with y'all. I don't think this is in the book either. I'm gonna give you another moment. There's a moment, Jeremiah 23. And Matt, you can fact check this. Jeremiah 23. Actually, I'm a little nervous. I'm gonna turn there right now just to make sure. No, but Jeremiah 23. I know it's Jeremiah 23, where Israel's navigating exile, right? And I hear a lot of language now about like how we're in exile and blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, I'm just going to say this. We only go into exile when we participate in what unmakes the nations. We don't go into exile when the nations are evil and bad and doing whatever. Like, it's actually about when we get in on that, when we start doing the things that unmake us, that break our lives apart, that's when we experience a form of exile. But going to this, there's this moment, and it's in verse 21. This is Jeremiah 23, verse 21. And this is God speaking. He said, "I did not send the prophets, and yet they ran." They wanted to have a word. They wanted to go deliver a message. They felt the pressure to have a message to deliver. "I did not speak to them, yet they prophesied. But if they had stood in my counsel, if they would have stood in my counsel, if they would have received from me, if they would have been silent with me, if they would have gotten to know me, if they would have been okay with the tension, then I would have given them words," right? "And they would have proclaimed my words to my people, and they would have turned them from their evil way and from the evil of their deeds. Am I a God at hand, declares the Lord, and not a God far away?" And I just love this like idea in this moment, like what would be so radically kingdom and countercultural is if we're people who are like, we feel the pressure to have a word. We feel the pressure have a response. We feel the pressure to make sense of whatever situation it is. I mean, it could be our families, it could be our organizations, it could be our community, it could be culture, political, whatever it is. But it's like, are we going to be people who like stand in the awareness of the counsel of God? Like that there is a perspective that is not driven by the voice and the tenor of the accuser. Like there is a way to navigate this forward that reflects the model of Jesus. One of the things I love about Jesus, among so many things, is that Jesus is what is ultimately true about God and us merged. He is the perfect intersection of what is most true about God and what we are capable of, like by his grace, by his spirit. That is the person of Jesus. He crossed the bridge between God's divinity and our humanity. That's why we say things like he's 100% God, 100% man. It's because in him we find that example. And that's why we follow him. That's what it means to follow Jesus, to believe that ultimately what he says about God, what he says about sin, what he says about the world, what he says about problems, injustice, righteousness, faithfulness, love, all of that is ultimately true. And we read scripture, we're like, how is that possible? Like this, there's tension between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Like, how is the God of the Old Testament the same as the God in the New Testament? I write about that, as you know, in chapter 4 and in some other places in this book. But here's the amazing thing. We see this moment in the Mount of Transfiguration where God he assembles the law and the prophets represented in Moses and Elijah and the Son, Jesus. And Peter's response is he wants to make altars for all of them. But what happens? The law and the prophets are subsumed in the Son. And the Father says, this right here, this is my beloved Son. This is the revelation that the law and the prophets have always pointed to. Like, I stooped within a religious framework to elevate you into higher forms of relationship. That's literally what grace means. It's a stooping to elevate. But here, right here, my Son, this is the reality of what it means to embody the life that I've called you to know and live and participate in. And so much of what I write in Words with God is built on the way Jesus lived and the way he prayed and how that moved out of the quote unquote sacred places of temple and Jewish culture and into the streets, into the fields, into the everyday lives of the people around him.
Yeah, I want to talk a little more about what you're talking with the silence and listening to, being intentional about listening to what God has to say to you. And I think as a society right now, we're so used to that the transactional nature of any relationship. And not only that, the immediacy of that transaction, that to sit in the silence and wait for that response, it's difficult. And I see a lot in society now, things that, such as like manifestation and taking what is prayer and directing that instead of towards the power of God. And now, what can I do? What can I make happen for myself? Because, maybe I don't have the patience for that response. And something you talk about in the book is your perception of God is how you're going to pray, determines how you pray. And something you really challenged me with was the difference of how you perceive God in relation to how you perceive Jesus. And it really challenged me to think about, what do I think about God and how does that affect my prayer? Something I wanted to have you talk a little bit more on is you talk about seeing God. I realized I had kind of a subconscious connotation with God of this intimidating figure that Jesus is this friendly, want to come in and give you a hug sort of guy. And you talk about seeing the Father through the Son, and I want you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a challenge. That's a challenge for for a lot of us to see God through Jesus, because we want, in general, we want to flatten things out so we can make sense of them and move on to whatever's next. And God is the topic that you don't flatten out and move on to whatever is next, because there really isn't anything that's next. Like that's the subject, that's the topic that thankfully we get to journey into forever, because that topic has implications for everything about us and what we're called to do and who we're called to become. But and I write about this in Words with God, but if you look at John's gospel in particular, and we don't have time to dive into all of this stuff, but this would be a fun one to really go deep in John's gospel. But you just from chapter, I think it's 5 to 17, the language that Jesus is using to describe his dynamic with the Father, to make it very clear to them and us, like, hey, the Father and I are one. If you see me, you've seen the Father. They tell him, hey, show us the Father, and that's enough for us. He's like, yo, come on, like right here. And then he shares some wild things in John 17 about the name and about a oneness. And I mean, it's amazing what he's sharing there. And then as you mature in that, you realize, man, so much of what we find in the story, the meta narrative of humanity as revealed in Scripture, so much of it is God, as I shared earlier, stooping into whatever construct, whatever religiosity we were capable of engaging with him in, to elevate us into higher forms of relationship. And I don't have time to break out like the Sinaitic covenant and how that played out in Exodus 19 and 20. I do touch on it briefly in the book. I think one day I'll probably write an entire book on that. It'll probably be a bit more heady than anything else. But there's so much there that bleeds into how we engage with God now to this day. And that's why Paul writes what he does in Galatians 4 about how the Abrahamic covenant, 3 and 4, Abrahamic covenant preceded the Sinai covenant by 430 years, and how he uses the term in Greek is like literally a babysitter. Like the Sinai covenant is a babysitter for you as you grow up. And Jesus tells him, he's like, look, y'all have this idea of how marriage works. God made allowances for you through Moses because your hardness of heart. Like there is a precedent. God said, hey, y'all telling Samuel, they don't know, king's a bad idea. And they're like, no, we want a king. God's like, king's a bad idea. I'm their king. No, we want a king. I was like, fine, I'll stoop within that framework. I'll give them a king, and I'll make it a whole messianic thing through David, Solomon. It's going to be this amazing story, even though it's going to lead them into exile and deliver them to the nations, and it's going to be bad for them, and everything that I said is going to happen. It's going to happen. I'm still going to do what only I can do through that. And so when we get that, we start to realize that so much of us missing God and not understanding God is because the religious framework that we tried to understand God through. And what Jesus is saying, he's saying, hey, the law and the prophets, they're not wrong, but they're signposts. They point to me. And if you want to make sense of them, like the only way to make sense of them and their view of God and how they explain God and how they explain how God interacts with humanity's plight and how God judges in mercy and executes mercy and judgment. I mean, dude, there's some wild stuff like where you're reading, like for instance, the prophet Joel, and it's like judgment, judgment, judgment. Nope, just kidding, mercy. Actually, the judgment is mercy. And God's like, hey, this is how I work. This is how I function. You break me into these different parts. You try to, coin like different types of God or different personalities of God, but it's all one. And any kind of dissonance is just, it's on our part and our perception of God. And Jesus, the person of Jesus, where all that harmonizes and makes sense.
I love that, man. You get talking and you get to talking. You get to preaching, man. And I just want to keep like being like, no, stop, wait, I have a question. But then you keep going, and then I get lost in what you're saying. Not like lost. I get like caught up in listening to what you're saying, and then I'm just you sent us like a PDF version of the book to read, and I was reading it on my phone and I started out reading the book, and I was like, I'm reading it on my phone, and I was gonna screenshot every time that like something stuck out that I was like, oh, we could talk about that. And I think I got to like the 8th chapter or something, and I had like 70 screenshots, and it was just like, this is crazy. I think there are two big things that I'd love to touch on. Are you still good on time? Do we need to?
I'm good, bro.
Okay,
We're
cool.
Good.
There are two things that I would love to start to talk about, because I think that so much of what I took out of the book and what I felt like you wrote about in the book was a lot of, honestly, a lot of things that people look at prayer that is not scriptural, right? And is not what Jesus taught, like not in the Bible, right? And it's a lot of people treat it as what we've been talking about of this transactional thing. And sure. That goes back to what is my favorite quote out of the book, of where I'll read it for you again. I already sent it to you, Addison, but I'll read it for the people.
Okay.
For some of us, prayers become a mechanism to get what we want without doing the work. Our society, writes Eugene Peterson, is cheapened by expectation of miracles. God is a supernatural shortcut, so we don't have to engage in a deeply dimensional, endlessly difficult, soaringly glorious task of being a human living by faith. What a quote, by the way.
Isn't that
But
a
to
great
finish
quote?
out the quote from the book that Mr. Addison Bevere wrote, we'll pray for health and healing while refusing to rest, eat clean, and exercise. We'll ask for financial blessing, yet reject Scripture's basic instructions on stewardship. We'll petition God for wisdom and purpose as we binge Netflix, rarely opening our lives to the Word and His ways. And so not only and I'm speaking for myself, right? I don't want to speak for anybody else, but not only have I know that I have treated prayer transactionally, but I've also treated prayer as this transaction that I don't want to pay anything for. Right. I
Yep.
want to just pray and get back out of. Right.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about that throughout the book. You talk about, you break down the Lord's Prayer. You do several other things. You talk all throughout the book about prayer. But one of the things you really stood out for me, and it was, you talked about being in constant prayer. Right.
Yeah.
And to me, that in my head, that is the opposite of transactional, because it's very relational. It's something that's constantly happening. And you wrote this, you said, when I first started studying what it meant to be in a constant prayer, I thought the idea was ridiculous. It sounded like constant work, but eventually I realized constant prayer is a place of rest, not another form of striving. It's a rest of the heart, a holy, deep breath. Such prayer keeps us reliant on God and His vision, so we don't slip back into believing we are gods with our own kingdoms to build, right? And so can you talk about that and maybe, expand a little bit more onto what you go into that with the book, but how do we be in constant prayer and not treat prayer like it's this transaction, particularly one that we don't want to pay our side of it. We just want to receive back from it.
Yeah. And just to finish the quote, if you don't mind, I'd actually love to, because what I don't want people to hear is like, oh, I've been binging too much Netflix. I can't, God's not going to answer my prayers, or God's not going to engage with me. I want to read what I go on to say. I mean, I agree. You read a quote from the book. So I stand behind everything that I said, but there's something else that I think people need to hear. And it's this. And I am actually going to read it. Now, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that our lives and pursuits must be in perfect order before we pray. Perfection in that sense is an illusion and the enemy of spiritual progress, or any form of progress for that matter. Besides, God uses our prayers to perfect us, so He would never discourage us from praying, no matter how perfect and no matter how imperfect our practice may be, right? So I just want y'all to hear that. But there is, to your point, Taylor, we treat God, and people use the term like a genie, sugar daddy, whatever. Like, hey, if I get the inputs right, then the outputs are going to be right? Like, if I figure out the formula of the transaction, if I put the right stuff in, I'm going to get the right stuff out. And that's just not how prayer works, period. And anyone who tells you that, they're wrong. Don't listen to a thing that they have to say about prayer. Anyone who gives you I'm serious, and I'm saying it this confidently, because I've spent enough time in prayer. I've spent enough time studying prayer, learning prayer from people who went the distance with God in prayer. I spent enough time with people I have so much respect for, who know how to pray. And I'm telling you all right now, the moment you box God, like even Paul in his prayers would pray with a sense of reverence. Like he would pray specific prayers. He would put demands on God, but there was always this like, God, your ways are higher. Like he quotes Isaiah in Romans 11, quotes Isaiah, like, shoot, your ways are above mine. Like they're just higher. And we all have to come to that place. And I talk about this. I'm going to get there. I'm going to get where you asked me to get, Taylor. I just want you to know I'm going to get there. But in the chapter where I talk about how should we ask, and a lot of people struggle with like, do I just pray God's will, or do I pray, like, do I give God his marching orders and then God does what I ask him to do in prayer? Like, which one is it? I'm just like, God, your will be done. Amen. And I'm good. Like, I participated in whatever I need to participate in prayer. And what I like to tell people is healthy prayer embodies three things. Like you don't have a healthy prayer life without these three things. And we see these three things embodied in how Jesus engaged with the Father in his moment of greatest need, the Garden of Gethsemane. There's three things. Number one, he was specific, right? So specific, write that down. Specific. Father, if there's any way this cup could pass. Anyway, let it pass, right? Anyway. Number two, he was steadfast. He prayed again and again. He told his buddies, like, hey, why aren't y'all praying with me? Like, I need you to pray. Like, we need to go after this thing. He was steadfast. And three, he was surrendered. Not my will, but yours be done. We want to just like be surrendered. Hey, God, your will be done. Or we want to be specific, like, God, I want this, I want that, I want you to do this by this date, I want you to. And the reality is we have to embody both in our prayers. Like God wants us to be specific. The Greek word ateia, which means to like the way we use it when like we're talking about asking through prayer, it can also be translated demand. Like, it is not a wimpy, like, oh, grovelly, like, hey, can you please? It's a I'm asking. Like I have the right to ask and I have a reason to ask. Like I belong in the presence of the one who I'm making the request to. And I fully believe that God wants us to ask. He wants us to ask with specificity because he wants us to be aware. We ask to become aware. When we don't ask, when we don't put those demands on God, if you will, we don't articulate our prayers, we live in a vague place, we don't see the faithfulness of God around us. We live unaware. We don't realize that right now in this moment, even amongst the struggle of some of the things that we're navigating, we're living in an answered prayer, even right now, from prayers that were prayed in the past, because they were too vague. Listen, God can do a lot with a vague prayer. I make that point in this entire book. Like, it's not about having the perfect words. It's not about praying perfectly. It's about doing it. But God can do a lot with a vague prayer, but it really doesn't do much for you because you don't see how it's all coming together. But when we pray specifically, when we allow the Spirit to work with our spirit and we step out, even when we miss it, God does something through that. God reveals something about his nature. And I write a good bit about that in the book. But going to what you said about praying constantly, that the chapter is called Open the Conversation. And that's the idea of praying constantly. If I was to describe, like when I share the story about my friend. Do you remember that story about, he told me like, I'm done with this whole prayer thing, disillusioned with church. He's not, like, he's done. Well, he's not, that's actually a cool story. But he was, and he's like, I'm done with this. And he said, God's the only one who gets away with not showing up for a conversation that I'm supposed to show up to daily. He's like, no one else would get away with that crap. He's like, no one else, only God gets away with that. Like any other relationship, I'd be like, I'm done with you. We're supposed to get together every morning and you don't show up. We're done. And that's really how he felt. And I love how God met him in that place of honesty. And my words for him in that moment was like, bro, you need to open the conversation. You have such a transactional view of God. Like, God's not meeting you where you think he should meet you because he doesn't want to meet you there. Like, there's so much more than that box that you're trying to put him in. Like, he will meet you there. Don't get me wrong. And we need to have that time of prayer where we're alone in the closet or alone on a walk, whatever. But the idea is that prayer would spill out of those times and into our everyday lives. And we see that in the person of Jesus. And in that chapter, I describe it as conscious time versus quality time. You have quality time where it's just like, for in marriage with Julie, we have quality time where it's just the two of us. It's scheduled, it's intentional, it's regular, and that's really important. But we spend the majority of our lives in what I call conscious time, where we're conscious of each other, but our lives are going in different directions. But there's something that happens even when we're separated that connects us. I mean, I think of what Paul says, like, I've been with you in spirit, I've made a judgment. Like, Paul was connected to them by the Spirit. And so opening the conversation looks like believing that when Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:17 and Romans 12:12 and Ephesians 6, when he says, pray constantly, pray at times, like, He's actually saying God wants to have words with you all the time, as I mentioned earlier, in both sound and silence. And that's pretty amazing. And then I realized, guys, when it hit me that the silence that I kept facing, and I'm talking 5 years, okay? Like 5 years of silence, like nothing, was actually an invitation. It wasn't, I thought it was a rejection. It was an invitation. The whole time I thought it was a rejection. The whole time I'm like, God's rejected me. I did something wrong. I disqualified myself somehow. I grieved the spirit of God. I mean, dude, I went everywhere. I'm like, what have I done? And it was not a rejection. It was an invitation. I realized like my idea of prayer and connecting with God and having words with God and how God engages with my brokenness and my process and my purpose and all of that. And also it got me, like you hear me use this language, my purpose, my process, it opened my eyes to the reality that even when Jesus taught us to pray, it was with an hour orientation. So many of us, we don't engage with God the way we're supposed to engage with him, is because we're praying so small in this my world, this little world of my, and we don't get outside of that and connect the dots and see the hour reality that we're called to pray in and lean into and work in, which just creates so much opportunity for God to move and show himself as who he is in our lives.
Yeah. What did that look like for you? You talk about 5 years of silence and then a realization that it's an invitation. What's that look like?
Yeah, well, I write about this in the book, so I don't know if you're like, setting me up or something, but I had this moment, and I had like a waterfall moment, right? I was in the kitchen of the place that I was staying, and y'all, I had read Psalm 127 so many times. It's not like I never read Psalm 127, okay? But I read it, and just something different happened to me. Where it says like it's in vain. Basically, it's in vain that you stay up late and get up early, eating the bread of anxious toil. And it hit me, y'all, like, what? And it was the next morning where I woke up with an invitation on my lips, essentially God saying like, prayer is going to become the center of your life. Will you share this? Will you write this? And that has become, to go back to one of your very first questions, Taylor, that for me, and I articulated this with my wife a while back, but I just said, if my life, and this is not just like how I minister on a stage. In fact, that's a very small part of it. It's not even just the books that I read. That's a part of it. It's a larger part of it than being on stage, to be honest with you. But if my life is a life where people leave my presence and they're inspired to go into God's presence, or like inspired to believe that God loves them or is for them or has a purpose for them. And I'm not just talking about the Christianese stuff. I'm talking about like there's something inside them that wakes up, something inside their heart that burns. Like that, to me, like I want to have that kind of connection with God, where that it has that effect on the people in my life. And I've seen that in parts, man. I have so much room for growth and that, but I've seen that in what the signposts that I've seen, man, that's so encouraging. And as far as like my work, I want to spend, as far like a part of what I do, spend the rest of my life helping people open the conversation, specifically like discipling and training people and what it means to have words with God. I took someone on a retreat, a spiritual retreat recently. His wife reached out to my wife and just said, hey, is there any way? He runs a big company and just had a lot going on. And there were some things that were really difficult that he was navigating. And I took him on a spiritual retreat, and we went away for a couple of days, and we did the silence. We did all sorts of, I mean, we did all of it. And seeing the effect, like how that was a turning point in his life, and seeing the fact, I'm like, God, if I can introduce people to a greater experience of who you are and how that unlocks the world around them and how they see you in their world, which is the final movement of the book. when we move into forgiveness, and we move into God's vision for the nations, and we move through trials and temptations, and we move into ultimately praying the name and what it means to pray the name. It's not a magical word. It's to surrender to the ultimate reality of who God is, the unfolding certainty of the purpose and the plans and the person of God. Like that, to me,
I love it because I'm not going to spoil this part of the book because there's a story that Addison tells in the book towards the beginning, but then kind of brings it up again later. But a story about a man that he prayed for kind of right after that waterfall moment that he spoke about, right? That he met and prayed for. And I just think it's crazy you writing that story and being in that place. And then now Words with God is here and it's coming out, right? And you talk about that waterfall moment of Psalm 127 and reading this and God putting this on your heart, and then this story that, once again, I don't want to spoil because it's a great piece. Just it really it has a lot of implications for the book and where Addison and his story that he talks about in it. But I think that I'm thinking through this, and this is one of the last things that I want to go over. That I think that one of people's big problems, one of my problems, I'll talk about me. One of my problems with prayer for so long, I think, is kind of what your friend talks about of, oh, God doesn't show up and it's this invitation, right? But you talk about in the book about several times about how prayer will always have an element of mystery, right? And we're not going to know it all. In fact, there's a quote in the book that says prayer, just as life, will always retain a form of mystery, and if anyone tells you otherwise, they're reducing God to their own image. I read that and went, whew, jeez, right? But can you just talk about that, about how I can give what I got out of the book based on that, but I would love to hear kind of what you would tell people who go, I don't want there to be a mystery. I want to pray and I want to know that it's going to happen. They want this transactional piece, but the mystery is actually something beautiful in it.
Yeah. So when it comes to God, and I mean, this is something that we all wrestle through, Taylor. I mean, you're not the only one. This is a part of the human experience. But when it comes to God, we're given both certainty and mystery, and we're supposed to hold them one in each hand. Like we don't get to let go of either one of them. You let go of either one of them, you're in trouble. You let go of certainty and you just have mystery. You can slide into some like weird new age stuff and just spiritualism and whatever you want it to be. You just hold on to certainty. You get into some, I don't even know if I need to describe what that looks like. I think anyone who's been in a religious circle for any amount of time knows exactly what that looks like. And so for us, when it comes to prayer, when it comes to God, we have to hold both of those, because we're not God. A God understood is no God at all. A God comprehended, literally the quote goes, a God comprehended is no God at all. I can't remember who said it, but basically said God created us in his image, and then we return the favor. And that's essentially like what we do when it comes to a lot of our constructs that God is supposed to fit in. And when it comes to life, like really take inventory of the things that are the most meaningful to you. And when you look back at your life, you're going to find they are parts of your life that were a convergence of what is mysterious and what is certain every single time, without fail. Yeah. You will find both of them present in the most meaningful moments of your life. And so, of course, prayer has to bring us to that place where we have eyes to see that it is indeed the convergence of mystery and certainty, where we meet with God and where God meets with us.
Listen, Matt,
I got a
something?
fact. Yes, the fact check.
Ooh, fact.
I'll log one in for this episode. It was St. John Chrysostom. I don't know how you say it. Is the one who said a comprehended God is no God.
Is that who it is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. I could not remember who said it.
So, guys, here's what's going to happen. Listen, we're winding down. Words with God is out everywhere. Go find it. There's a link down below. You can go check out Addison everywhere as well. I'm going to give Addison a second just to say something. But Addison, there, I'm kind of blown away by reading your book and what I got out of it, and then having this conversation with you, because I hope that everyone out there, whoever listens to this at any time and any point in the future, is if you really listen to the words that Addison has been saying in this, right? Addison, you speak with a passion, right? You speak with a confidence. You speak knowing whose you are. And that passion comes through in the book, everybody. Okay. So it's not just this book where words were written down and then they were there. That passion and that love and that what you're hearing in his voice, it comes out in the book. And I think what's crazy is Matt and I have this little chat over in the corner that Matt and I can talk back and forth to if we have questions or we're trying to say something. And
so that's what y'all have been doing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. We've been texting. We've been talking to each other behind your back, man. But what's crazy is we just talked about how there's so much more that I would love to talk about with you. We've already covered so much, but it feels like there's so much that we've missed. And there's so many things that Addison, I'm probably just going to call you maybe in a couple weeks when your marketing travel has calmed down a little bit. But there are stories that you tell in the book about you and your son Asher and your guys' relationship. And it is one, I have two sons myself, and it brought tears to my eyes of wow. That relationship that you have with your son, and it inspired me to talk to my sons about some of that stuff. And there's just so much more. But guys, I'm telling you, you need to go get the book. You need to go check out Words with God. Addison, do you have anything else that you would like to say? Any other thing you'd like to say about the book, about you, anything at all? Shout out anything you'd like to.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you again so much for the time. And I've enjoyed the unhurried conversation. A lot of my conversations kind of get in there and get out. So it's fun taking time with y'all to travel all over the place, and your hunger for God and for prayer and for truth. I mean, it's very apparent. So I've enjoyed it. What I would share with people, listen, we touched on it earlier, but the accuser is terrified of you having words with God, even if the words are messy and muddy and earthy and whatever, inarticulate. Like, God finds a way to meet you in those places. And so I just want to encourage you, like, God does want to have words with you. God's more invested in you getting life right than you are. He's more committed to you flourishing than you could ever understand. And he wants to walk this out with you. And if it feels like God's withholding answers from you, it may be because your view toward God is, God, give me the answers so I can kind of get on with my life and do what needs to be done. And God's actually like, hey, I'm the answer. Like, I'm actually what you want. Like, you could have success. You could have, and we all have. I mean, I think, Taylor, I know, Matt, I don't know your story as well, but Taylor, I know you've had a lot of success. And the truth is, there's just a next success to have. There's a next challenge. There's a next season. And when we make that our pursuit instead of pursuing the person of God, man, it's just so easy to miss out on the goodness that life has to offer us. And so I would encourage you, please get this book, get it for the people in your world. You know who they are, who are struggling to have words with God. The testimonies that I'm already getting from people who are like, I'd given up on having words with God, but now I am again. Thank you so much. Are you giving me permission, giving me language? There's a lot of practical stuff in the book too. Again, I teach how to pray through the Lord's Prayer the way it was actually designed and meant to be prayed through, and not as a formula, but as a framework. I share some other prayers that have been very meaningful to me. There's a whole chapter on a 3-word prayer that God gave me that's been so key to my ability to recenter in the midst of the craziness of life. And so I'm not good at this. I'm not good at, like, quote unquote selling stuff. If it's mine, I could sell stuff as other people, but if it's mine, I'm not good at it. But I'm telling y'all, I really feel like this book was a gift. And so I'm telling you, like, please go get it. I promise you will not be disappointed with the way God meets you through it. So that's what I would share.
I love it so much, man. Hey, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being obedient and writing this book, honestly. And I'm very excited to see what people are going to take out of it. So appreciate you, man. Love you as always.
Man. Appreciate you, man. Love you too, bro. Matt, it's
Boom.
good meeting
You
you,
as
bud.
well. Thank you.